Welcome back here on Live Now from Fox, 11:08 on the East Coast and 8:08 on the West Coast. Once again, taking a live look at the Supreme Court as we do follow the latest opinions that have now been handed down. The court striking down affirmative action in college admissions, forcing institutions of higher education to look for new ways to achieve diverse student bodies. The court's conservative majority overturning admissions plans at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, the nation's oldest private and public colleges, respectively. I do want to bring in Roger Severino, there we go, Vice President of Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us to help kind of break this all down for us.
Great, my pleasure.
So first off, just explain what this decision actually means when we are talking about affirmative action.
Well, it means in college education, the check-the-box system of getting into school based on race is dead and buried. Under the Grutter decision, it allowed diversity to be included as one of the factors in college admissions, which had been abused by Harvard and UNC, to have effectively a race-based quota system. And what they did was set a cap on Asian American students. They couldn't really get above 20% ever. And that was unjust, against the law, and contrary to our Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. And that's what the court ruled today, is that our Constitution is in fact colorblind, that we are supposed to abide by Dr. Martin Luther King's injunction that we're to be judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. And these applications for college have to be based on individuals and individual merit and individual qualifications. And you can't simply give bonuses based on skin color and what was going on in the Harvard case, negative points if you were Asian American. They were capped and they were being held down even though they had high SAT scores, high GPAs. There was a personality score that Harvard used that was saying that Asians were not as kind or not as interesting. And that is a form of racism that the Supreme Court said is impermissible.
Now the question is, are you surprised by this ruling coming down? Because it sounds like a lot of people had said at this point that they kind of expected that the justices were really considering doing this, considering that they took up the case altogether.
That's right. And Harvard was not pleased with how oral argument went. The justices were clear that they were going to apply the Constitution and going to apply federal law against discrimination in the educational space. Harvard, in response, lo and behold, found a way to admit more Asian students. For the first time in perhaps decades, the Asian admission went up by several percentage points because they were trying to get ahead of it. But it didn't work. The Supreme Court saw through it and said, no, we know that you've been taking race into account bluntly, not diversity. And if you look at some other numbers, only 8% of incoming Harvard students are conservative. About 82% of the incoming students come from wealthy backgrounds. That is not a diverse body in terms of intellectual diversity and not diverse in terms of background, but they wanted to put their thumb on race because they were race obsessed. And the dissent was disappointed, and they made clear, especially Ketanji Brown Jackson, that they subscribe to a critical race theory view of the world, of structural racism being everywhere, that you cannot overcome it unless you discriminate against other races to get there. And that's simply not what the Supreme Court held. It rejected that. It went back to the founding, that we are all created equal. It went back to the 14th Amendment, which came out of the Civil War, saying that we cannot measure people based on skin color. And that is the just result. And we're going to see that it's going to help everybody when you have equal opportunity, including minorities that were being put in places where they're being set up for failure, right? That's another part of the story. If you have this boosting and punishment based on race, we're going to have a mismatch, and it will ultimately end up hurting the people you're allegedly trying to help.
Anything about this ruling that surprised you? Anything that came down in that decision that you either weren't expecting or kind of caught your eye?
There weren't too many big surprises, and it's about 237 plus pages, so it's a lot to digest. But this oral argument cued in what the debate was going to be about. We do see that they're going to allow the essays to still take a prominent role, and that's appropriate, where you can say that you face particular struggles in your life, overcoming a disability, overcoming racial discrimination. That's all valuable because it indicates individual character, and that's going to be allowed. What's not going to be allowed is you get to check a box and you get X bonus points, or you get demerits if you're of a particular race. That is flatly prohibited. And we're going to interesting to see what Harvard's going to do. They're pushing things like eliminating the SAT, because Asian Americans do quite well on standardized tests disproportionately, because of all sorts of factors that Harvard thinks we're going to get rid of it in order to keep those numbers down, right? So if they're doing these underhanded sort of tricks to try to still do racial quota balancing, and that has to be ended as well. Part of it's going to be in enforcement through the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and in the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office, to make sure that if they do anything that has a disparate impact based on minority status, then that's illegal. And people should be able to sue and find out, are you still tracking the numbers? And is it all about the numbers? And it's really a form of a quota system by another name.
And you kind of already touched on this, but when would everything kind of take effect? Is it as of this moment, as of the time that the ruling did come down?
That's right. Unless the court said we're going to give you 30 days or something, which I did not see, then the Constitution is in effect, and it had been effectively suspended for a few years when the court allowed this sort of racial balancing. And the court finally said enough is enough. And a lot of credit goes to the litigants who were brave enough, the Asian Americans who stood up and said enough is enough, to Will Consovoy, who is the lead attorney, who did not actually, unfortunately, survive to see this day in person. A lot of people stood up to the machinery of the left that is hyper-focused on race above all else, even though a large majority of Americans reject racial preferences in schools and in workplace, et cetera, including minorities who reject this balancing based on race. We do believe in equal opportunity, not guaranteed equal outcomes. That's why people from all over the world come here, immigrants from countries coming from abject poverty, the story of my parents coming in. They came because America promised that equal shot, equal shake, and you are measured based on your ability, your grit. In my case, I did go to Harvard Law School, but I refused to check the box, even though my culture is important to me. My parents' hard work, my parents' prayers, and a lot of the work I did to get there, I wanted to be recognized on that and not simply a blunt checking of the box. And the Supreme Court is affirming that today.
Do you think there's ever going to be another change to affirmative action down the line? I know it's impossible to predict the future. Just based on what you have seen, though, is it possible that this eventually gets, I guess, overturned, or something else is put into place that makes affirmative action come back?
It won't be overturned anytime soon. It will be resisted greatly by the Biden administration, by the Harvards of the world. You already had Chuck Schumer saying this somehow hurts opportunities of people of color, ignoring the fact that the people of color being hurt in this case were Asians. Do they no longer count because they're the wrong minority? It's this sort of disappointing response from the left that we expect to see going forward. They will be resisting this. However, the diversity rationale was mortally wounded. The notion that you need different skin colors such that the government must do this sort of balancing, otherwise we're not or a just society, was rejected. The just society is everybody is allowed to make their best case, and you cannot discriminate against, say, Asians because you think there are too much of them in a particular place. That has been soundly rejected. So this has spillover in other places. We'll see it impacted in the workplace, in federal contracting, in federally funded programs. This diversity rationale, which has been pushed by the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion infrastructure, that, again, I think it's taken a severe blow, and it's going to play out in other areas more than just higher education.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Is there anything else that you want to add about all of this before I let you go?
Yeah, and this goes back to a long history of the vision of America. Are we all created equal or not? Are we all entitled to equal protection of the law or not? Should we be measured by the content of our character, not the color of our skin? And those foundational principles were actually vindicated today.
All right. Thank you again for taking the time to be here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.